right, what I want to do is finish up this specific section, because the one thing that we haven't been able to do very well, because I'm trying to get through this information quickly, is to show you each of the constructs in a specific area. We kind of looked at it a little bit, but we didn't really do it rigorously in the previous one in life. I've done that before, but in this one, I think it'll be very easy to do. The point that I want to start back again with is we looked at, and I don't think I listed them out here specifically. We looked at economic systems, because economic systems are really easy to prove, and we can define them very specifically. And we saw that, you know, barter is natural. Capitalism, once you have capital, once you have dollars, and we'll talk a bit more about dollars and about currencies, because it's a very important thing, but we've laid the foundations in proof, because these are very easy things to prove historically. We saw how there are three perturbations that are caused by government. Without these perturbations, you know, you can't have capitalism without government. You really can't have trade without government, because government has to provide rule of law. This is really a critical thing, and the purpose of government, we proved it historically, is to protect private property. There really isn't any other, and I can go into more detail about that. There's a lot more to say about that specifically that we can prove, but the most important thing to kind of get out of that idea of private property is economics. And economics, like I said, there are two natural systems that come about just because of rule of law and protection of private property. There are three systems that come out because of government power. You cannot have socialism without government power. Government has to control the businesses. You can't have communism without government power, because government has to control the means of production and own all private property. You cannot have a fascist economy without the government regulating and controlling property and controlling businesses. These are required, and you would say, well, are these not just natural progressions of government? Not if the purpose of government is to protect private property as opposed to control private property. So that's why we call them perturbations. And so at the end here, I've got this, you know, examples of fascist economic systems. The reason I wanted to kind of focus that is because I told you, and I think it's very easy to show and prove, that the U.S. is in a fascist economic system right now. Even one of our Supreme Court justices, I can't remember who said it, but said we have too many laws. He's wrong. It's not just laws, it's regulation. I'll talk about laws and regulation in a little bit. Socialism, precursor to communism, I want to mention that very quickly. The term, appearance of the term socialism is variously ascribed to Pierre Liolle or to Mary Luce Redbond of France, or else in England, Robert Owen, considered the father of the cooperative movement. Communists consider socialism a step toward communism. Fascism, if you remember, the National Socialists. People don't understand unless they know German. Yes, ma'am. Oh. If you speak German, you know that Nazi is an acronym for National Socialism. The Nazis considered themselves socialists and were socialists. They used fascism to control the government. So you might ask yourself the same thing about our government to a degree. In any case, under each of these systems, that is fascism, socialism, and communism, you do not possess or control private property. And that's a real problem because of the definition of government and the definition of what the purpose of government is. So let's look really quickly at culture. We looked at history, and we used history to prove the purpose of government and prove the purpose of economic systems, or to define economic systems. There really are no other major definitions for economic systems. I wish there were. It might be a happiness to have others. I will mention this. You notice that feudalism is a type of communism or socialism, because in feudalism, the guy who controls and owns the property is the monarch or the aristocrat, and the people are considered slaves or thralls to his labor. In any case, let's look at culture really quickly. The construct of culture, because we were working in the construct of history. You say, well, what's the difference between culture and history? Well, they aren't exactly as separate as you would like them to be, but they are slightly separated. And you say, well, how can that be? I'll point out to you one of the main things we see is that private property reaches a peak under an agrarian-based culture. What's an agrarian-based culture? That's a culture where most of the people are farmers. You say, why is that? Well, once you move out of feudalism, we'll talk about this. This is really an interesting thing because a lot of people don't understand this. But in a farm-based culture, the expectation is you own what you grow, right? You own your property. That was not true until the United States of America in about the 1830s or so, or really the beginning of America. One of the things about America that makes it significantly unique is the expectation of the ownership of private property. Who owned private property in Europe? Who owns all the property in Europe? You know? What's that? Yeah, well, you say government, which is not wrong, but it's really the sovereign. The sovereign, the Queen of England, the King of England now, Charles by law owns all the land in Europe, or all the land in England, and he is the sovereign. In France, even though there's no royalty, the royalty was disbanded and the government is in the place of the royalty. They're called the sovereign state. Because I lost my case before the Supreme Court in America, the sovereign state owns your property. That's what my case in the Supreme Court was all about. And because I lost, the Obama administration argued that the state owns all your property. So the state can legislatively take your property. Now you say, what about eminent domain? I was not allowed eminent domain in the state of Florida, even though the Constitution of Florida and the U.S. Constitution are required, because the state legislatively took my property. I was able to get it back, but I'm just saying that in the United States today, you do not own private property by law. It belongs to the sovereign state, and the state can take your property at any time. Hopefully, in the future, a Supreme Court ruling will change that back. But in America, the reason America was so different than the rest of the world is because the American farmer, the agrarian culture, they owned the land. And therefore, they owned what they produced on the land. And what that did is that, and I should have the chart. If you ever go look at the chart of agricultural, calories per year. The calories per year in the world did this with the advent of America. Because for the first time in history, the world had a culture that was not a starvation culture. And the reason was because of land ownership. Slowly in Europe, the Europeans began to change. The state still owns the property, but they guaranteed property for 99 years to the owners, to the people who, to the peasants, to the commoners. Today in England, you can buy property. However, under what we call British law or French law, especially French law, you can't own the property longer than 99 years. It will go back to the state unless you have other things you do. People are surprised. You go to Mexico and you buy property in Mexico. Mexico is a French law culture. And so if you go to Mexico, upon a Napoleonic law, your deed will say it's for 99 years. And then you're done. But the biggest thing is that property ownership ended starvation in the first world, and most of that was due to culture, because of food, because of land ownership. And this was really, really important. This is easily provable. It should make just logical sense to anyone. Well, I'll give you an example. Remember in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, the 5-year program, Stalin took all the property from the people, from the farmers, and they had collectives, right? And they starved. They had the largest farms in the world, wheat farms. For some reason, their productivity was really low. So after the first 5-year program, and they starved 20 million people, approximately 5 million people, I think, kulaks, especially in Ukraine, which is also part of Russia, by the way. The Soviet Union said, well, let's do this. Let's let the people have an acre of their own on each of the collectives. So each family got an acre where they could produce their own product. Guess what happened?
Increased production.
In fact,
on the acre.
On the acre, they were producing more on the acre than the entire collective of thousands of acres was producing. Now, did they learn their lesson? No. They just said, well, I don't know what they said. I have no idea what they said. The texts don't exist. But most of us would say, I can figure this out. William Bradford. Remember William Bradford? I read this to my kids every Thanksgiving. William Bradford, the Mayflower Compact was a communist compact where they owned all the property together. In the first 2 years, they almost died in starvation because they did not produce. When the new people came on the second year, Bradford said, didn't know what to do because they weren't part of the Mayflower Compact. So he gave them property. In that year, the people who owned their property produced 10 times more food than those who had held property in common. So Bradford said, maybe we should give this up. And he did. And guess what? Thanksgiving is because William Bradford gave up his communist, the Mayflower Compact. They gave it up, went away from the common. Anybody heard the tragedy of the commons? The tragedy of the commons comes from that, the Boston Commons, because the tragedy of the commons is that when property is owned in common, who takes care of it? Nobody takes care of it. And the tragedy of the commons was the Boston Commons was trashed. The whole property that was owned in common, and there is still an area that's considered Boston Commons. It's like a park. And we know what happens in parks unless the government takes care of it, and then they don't let you go on it, right? Anyway, there's issues. Property ownership is huge. The problem is cultures move from agrarian to urban and industrial. Private land ownership appears to them to be of less importance because you're not dependent personally on the land for the production or sustenance. Someone else usually owns the land for the factory, the business, the organization. We hear this stuff about big business. Let me point out to you something about big business. Can big business take your life, your liberty, or your property? Not legally. We can talk about law and court and criminal stuff, but who can take your life, liberty, and property? Government. Matter of fact, it's allowed under the Constitution. You commit a crime, you commit tort, today the regulatory state can take your license. FAA, for example, or doctors, they can take away your doctor's license. And how far are you going to get with that? Eventually they'll arrest you because you're practicing medicine or practicing flying without a license. This could be a bad thing. I'm back alive. Anyway, so there's also another point that I want to make that I think is important, because if you realize we're looking at the cultural construct. The cultural construct is really important because, as I said, everyone who owns a farm or everyone who's agrarian or comes from an agrarian background understands how important private property is. However, once you become an industrial, if you're a factory worker, right? Or you're a longshoreman working in a port, how important is that private property of that port to you? Well, it isn't very important to the United States because a lot of the private property for ports belongs to communist China today in America, which is really interesting. And you notice a current issue, just bring it up, current issue is the communists or other foreign nations or foreign nationals owning American property. Or maybe certain billionaires like Gates owning large amounts of property. That's an interesting problem, isn't it? Now, if you're a property owner, then you see the importance of private property. Now, would there be a reason why someone might want to discourage property ownership? What do you think property ownership, lack of property ownership does culturally to people? This is Frank. Go ahead.
Well, you see that in the cities all the time. There are very few people in the city that own property, so they're much more susceptible to some of these communal communist. It draws them in a little easier because they don't have property ownership. Well, without that, it's a lot easier to convince them that, hey, the government will take care of you because they're more used to it.
Right. You don't take care of those things which don't belong to you, right? Anyone here want to say it's just a rental?
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody says it, right?
Something needs to be repaired, you go to your the owner of the apartment.
Right.
And you don't think about doing it yourself, and it just lends the people to that type of mentality. And that's why cities are so liberal.
I think that's truth. I just want to point out that we usually think, like I said, each construct is almost like its own column or pillar of information. And if you realize when people are talking within constructs, within for example, cultural construct, then it allows you to develop arguments. The minute someone moves out of that construct, though, for example, or tries to move out, now you have a problem because it's very hard to prove something outside of that. If we're sticking in this construct, we can see it. I want to point this out too. In the past, privacy in history and culture is equal to private property. Why is that? If the property is private property, can the government come on it? Not without a warrant, right? Can anyone else come on it? Not unless you invite them. That's my problem down at the beach. I'm constantly fighting the beach because the government wants to allow people in my backyard every day, and they fight me. I've actually been sued by the government on this. I've won. Like I said, in one case I lost, but I still got my rights back. But this is a constant problem because even though I own the property, I should be able to exclude people from my property. But yet the government has a hand in preventing that. The other problem with privacy versus private property is, like I said, you used to be able to guarantee that you had privacy because you owned property. However, today, anyone heard of easements? Easements came with FDR and Discovery. And people don't know this, but do you remember in the old days, what did they have that the city was required to maintain off your property? You can see them down in downtown.
They used to have alleys that ran behind homes and businesses.
They used to have alleys, not easements. The alleys belonged to the city, and the city ran utilities through the alleyways. And the people, you did not own that. You could use it just like a public street or like a street, and it gave you access to your property. You can see this in a lot of large cities in the past. Today, since FDR and what we call discovery, the government instead was granted easements on your property. So you may have an easement in the front for a sidewalk. You may have an easement on the side for utilities. That gives the government a right, which you did not extend to them, to come on your property at any time to check your meter, to see what electricity you're using. They can go all the way around your house if they stay in the easement. They're not allowed to come into your house to check what is in there. So many times if you're on a tax, getting taxed, right, if they think that you have improvements in your house, if they note from the outside, that's when they increase your taxation, because they'll say, you have other stuff you've added. Yes, sir.
I just remember growing up, you used to have meter readers, and they would come into your house, and they open the door, meter reader, and you walk in the house, and they go downstairs and look at the reader. Now, a lot of that stuff they moved outside.
That if the founding fathers knew about that, they would have a cow, because theoretically, no one can come into your home or on your property without a warrant. And this is a really important part of culture, because we basically have subsumed to culture. I'll point this out. I've seen it in the modern world. If you say something that the FBI doesn't like on X or Facebook or whatever you've got, they are literally coming to people's houses. And I've seen it. They say, I'm FBI, and the guy goes, well, show me your badge, what's your name? And they will not tell them the name, they will not show their badges. And they're rightly a citizen, what they're doing is trying to trick you, which is interesting. These people are really from the FBI, but they're trying to trick you. They're required by law to show you their badge. They cannot be armed. If they're armed, that's illegal. That's another problem. We'll talk about the rights of the government in a little bit. But, the only armed people under the government allowed are the Army and the Navy, not any armed secret police. That's illegal. It's an illegal thing. It's only come about, again, in law since the 1920s, in the Prohibition era, with the advent of the FBI and the CIA. Yes, sir.
I just opened the mail yesterday and had something. We were traveling in Iowa last weekend or the weekend before, and I had a speeding ticket in the mail.
Whoa.
There was a picture of a camera and saying you were speeding. It didn't tell me how much. It just said you were speeding. You're paying this amount. Well, it came in the mail.
Lionel, one thing that the easements or the alleyways we use on a regular basis as members of Holy Cross who pray at the Planned Parenthood is because we have to be very careful that we don't put a big puddle on their private property. But there's an alleyway that runs behind there, so we're allowed to be in that alleyway, and conveniently their parking lot is on the other side of that alleyway, so that people who are coming for the Planned Parenthood business have to walk across the alley to get into the building. So therefore, if there are people praying and, we have an opportunity to have a conversation, but there's also a city-owned parking lot that's on the other side, so we can go clear around their property by staying on the sidewalk, in the alleyway, and in that business, that city-owned parking lot. And it's all because we can't be on their private property.
That's correct. And what's really interesting, and this is moving back, actually this is moving into Madden's Law of Construct, I think I have this under, maybe I should do that. As private property goes away or the right of use decreases, the right of privacy is seen in a different aspect. As a matter of fact, the magic of Roe v. Wade was built on the idea of privacy, which that's not in the Constitution, is it? Oh, as I said, as your ideas of private property go away, you must now have privacy, which, by the way, are not granted by any law. The FAA claims that they own the airspace above your house. The only thing that the FAA claims, the government claims you own, is the area in your house. So it's really neat to see that they have now claimed that you actually have, I think, 400 feet above you. So they've claimed, so you could make a claim to that. So if a drone comes within your property line within 400 feet, then you should be able to shoot it down, theoretically. And that has become a problem for some states because the FAA, look, the government has so many regulations, they have no clue what's going on. These are not laws, these are regulations. However, if they affect your private property, that's going into man's law. So anyway, the right to privacy, the Supreme Court, thank God, came back. They should have excluded the idea of the right to privacy because the right to privacy is the right to private property, or the right to private property is the right to privacy. The right to privacy means the government has no authority without a warrant from a court to come on your property. Now, I'm going to point this out. I don't have man's law in here. I'm going to go into the Old Testament in a moment. But under man's law, for example, remember I told you there are fascist, socialist, and communist economies. That are perturbations. However, fascist economies tend to be connected to a fascist government. Tend to be. Socialist economies tend to be connected to a socialist government. Communists tend to be connected to a communist. Who owns our water in Wichita? The city. What is that? Socialism. Who owns Evergy? It's a government-allowed monopoly. They control it. Fascists. My point is simply this. What you tend to do, and this is man's law, is in fascist, socialist, and communist economies, you have to exert law to make them work. So if I have way too many laws or regulations, for example, the laws apply to you if you go to the Planned Parenthood clinic, and the police will actually arrest you, and you can be convicted under RICO and also under the FACE Act. Yes, you can be prosecuted by the FBI and by the government and put in jail for years. Some old lady was praying in front of a clinic, just got 3 years in prison, I think. She's 80-something years old. So the government will do that, but for me, I have a trespasser on my property, let's say on the beach, where I make, part of my living. And I call the police, and the police ignore it. Ignore it. My right to private property, my right to privacy, my rights are ignored. Why? Because I'm not part of the protected class. Because governments, fascist, socialist, and communist governments tend to make a lot of laws that they don't then pursue for certain groups. For example, you see in the paper every day, somebody was shot. What do you expect to see in the article about the shooter? He was a convicted felon that wasn't supposed to have a gun. Well, how can that be? Right? Why would there be a convicted felon that's out on the loose, and why would he be allowed to have a gun? We have laws against that, right? But see, what happens is they'll say, oh, we need more gun laws and more gun laws. And then what happens? You, for example, following your concealed carry rights in Kansas, walk into some place. Now, luckily, they can't do this in Kansas, but you walk in with a concealed weapon, and they arrest you. You're not a felon, you're not whatever. They wouldn't arrest the felon, but they'll arrest you because they can. The more laws you have, the easier it is for the government to use it to persecute those who are legally doing things as opposed to those who are illegally doing things. We think law protects us, but way too many laws, and especially regulatory state stuff, can be a terrible burden on society. And you would say, and I guess I'm going to move into this later, but I'll just mention it now. But you'll say, don't we need some regulations? Actually, there is no regulatory law in the Constitution. There are two types of law in the Constitution: crimes and tort. Crimes are when you intentionally break the law. The government can take away your life and your property. Your life, liberty, and property. They can put you in jail for breaking the law intentionally. That's crime. Tort means you did it unintentionally. You can be sued, for example, for harming someone because you produced a product even if it was unintentional. That's tort. Whereas regulation, no one's ever heard of regulatory law. What? Theoretically, under the Constitution, the government cannot prosecute you for not following a regulation. However, as we mentioned, as a pilot, the FAA can prosecute me if they perceive I'm not following their rules, even though they're not law, even though they have nothing to do with tort. But if they don't like what I'm doing, they can actually take me and take away my license. Yes, sir.
It's really just a system of good intentions.
Yeah, and we know where good intentions lead, right? Directly to hell. Let's look at private property in the Old Testament, because that's another construct, right? And I told you I want to go through the constructs. So private property in Exodus and Leviticus. You shall not steal. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. That's Leviticus. Deuteronomy. You shall not steal. All right. What does God think about private property?
When you steal, it belongs to everybody.
God has this real thing about private property. And I told you that historically we can prove that once you have a government, you have laws and protect private property. That's one of the points. That is the only purpose of government, is to protect private property. Now, life and liberty are types of private property. Your life is your most private of property. So government's purpose is to protect life, liberty, and property. Period. Dot. That's it. And you know what? You know where we got that idea? It's from God. God, I don't think God had to tell you, because every 3-year-old in the world says, that's mine, right? And we'll fight another 3-year-old over that's mine, even if it isn't, right? Because private property. You shall not steal. By the way, if you do steal, what are you supposed to do? What's your repentance under natural law, God's law? 4 and 5 times. Yeah, it depends on the item, but 4 or 5 times. Because you're not supposed to do it, and it's supposed to dissuade you. Today we put people in jail, which is, I think, against God's will. What you're really supposed to do is make them pay it back 4 or 5 times. They might get the idea after doing that once, that that's not a good thing to steal. But we don't believe in punishing people today. Deuteronomy 19, do not move your neighbor's boundary stone set up by your predecessors in the inheritance received in the land of the Lord your God is giving to you to possess. And in Deuteronomy 27, it says, cursed is the man who moves his neighbor's boundary stone. And all the people said, amen. Cursed. In other words, where's your repentance? If you're cursed, there is no repentance. A person who moves a boundary stone is considered cursed. There's no repentance from curse. Period. Dot. So what do you think God thinks about property? Actual physical, estate type property or owner property. He says you're cursed. Proverbs, do not move an ancient boundary stone set up by your forefathers. Proverbs 23, do not move an ancient boundary stone or encroach on the fields of the fatherless. And I've got some notes here about this stuff, about the words specifically, but that's okay, because we'll move on. The New Testament, I don't have to tell you. I don't have to tell you what the New Testament says, because remember, at the very beginning of the class, I told you, what does Jesus say about the Old Testament? Not a jot or a tittle, not a mark or any punctuation of the Old Testament is changed. I came to fulfill the law, not to change the law, not to remove the law. So Jesus himself is telling you, and this is something people get really, I think, incorrect. It's, I think, an evangelical trait. They believe Jesus came and changed the law. Jesus did not change the law. The natural law is the basis for all New Testament. What did Jesus say Jesus did add something to the law. What did he say? What's that?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
No, that's actually an Old Testament quote, which is really interesting. What he said that was a little different. He said, if anyone teaches a child to not follow the law of God, they should what? Have a millstone thrown around their neck and tossed into the sea. In other words, Jesus said corporal punishment, capital punishment, for teaching a child something against the Old Testament. Swimming with the fishes. So how much did Jesus think? Well, Jesus is God, but Jesus is very serious about this stuff, right? So that's why when I say, the Old Testament affirms the New Testament, in an issue like this, an issue of historical note, I told you we can prove it historically, we can look at it culturally. I talked a little bit about man's law within the context. We look at the Old Testament or God's law, and then the New Testament, what does it do? It always affirms God's law. Now, there are other subjects where you can move into the New Testament construct as a separate idea. For example, if we were talking about salvation, right? Because there is no salvation in the Old Testament. It's just not available. The Old Testament is to show us in natural law how human beings can't meet God's requirements. But the New Testament provides salvation. So if we were to talk about salvation, we could move into the New Testament construct and begin to develop an argument from there. But we don't have to. Here's harm. And I want to just point out from harm standpoint really quickly, because I hadn't mentioned much about harm. You can take your harm matrix. And, we as Christians believe in 10. If you're cursed for moving the boundary stone, you're eternally separated from God. You better figure out something. I put the boundary stone back, just saying. It's not going to result in death necessarily. However, look at this, social or economic death. So if the government conscripts your property, like they're trying to steal every so many years, the government tries to steal my property down in Florida. And by the way, I told you, they stole your property. So how many are paying property taxes on their property? So do you own your property? You have a deed, but the government is making a claim on your rent, making a claim on you through your property taxes that you don't. They're telling you that you're renting your property. So conscription of property, you could get to the point where they basically make it impossible for you to use your property. Like I said, they try to do that to me all the time. Economically boycott or take away your economic viability. I mentioned before, if the government comes to me and says, well, we don't like what you did, we're going to take away your license. I can't fly. Or I'm going to take away your medical license because I don't like what you think about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. Or I don't like the way that you're giving drugs to people, maybe.
California legislature is going to do that.
They're going to try to do that, even though the CDC in their papers say that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are wonderful against the COVID. I call it the CCP WMD, but.
So, where does banking fall into this? Because, there was, like you said, Sam Brownback, this charity organization was denied something for the IRS and Bank of America. It was a big thing many months ago, and I never heard the resolution of that. They were going to cut them off as a charity.
Debanking.
Yeah, and so how does that fit into the government picture? Because
Yeah, I'm gonna try and move into that, but
Okay.
I'll mention it right now because I think it's a very pertinent point. It's a really good point. Where does, let's say, private and government go? Remember, if you remember the specific rule of government, what is the purpose of government? Protect private property, right? So a bank is doing what? Whose property is the bank keeping? Your private property, right? So what should the government's purpose be in regard to the bank?
Make sure you're protected.
Make sure that you're protected. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, and I think we've gone way too far with FDIC stuff, because, and we'll talk about this when we get to the next part about capitalism itself, but the, FDIC, where if you have so many, if you have less than, I think, $250,000 now in the bank, the government will make you right if something happens to the bank. This is the difference between a private, so if you make an agreement with a private bank, it's the bank that has to make right, not the government, not the people, right? But the government's role is not to regulate, in my opinion, the banks, but to protect your private property. So in the old days, and in my view of God's law, if a bank loses your money through no fault of your own, then who has to pay it back? The bank and their families and the owners and whatever. And, the bank itself, from all the people who work in it to whatever their facilities are, to whatever. You just do that one time. And they used to do that, bank failures would result in the decimation of a family because the family would then be held responsible for the bank's losses. And guess who got paid? People got paid. Many times they didn't get paid fully. It's like a stock. Stocks don't guarantee that you're going to have no loss, but theoretically, the people that get paid back with a failure of a business, first the owners, the people that specifically had ownership in that company, if the company fails, they're on the rocks to provide for whatever their obligation was. They have to pay off their creditors, they have to pay off everybody, then they pay off their corporate bonds. Once they pay off their corporate bonds, well, usually the government wants their government bond money first, but the corporate bonds, and then the next people are the stockholders. Lots of times the government lets them get off paying the stockholders. Remember when GM went bankrupt? Do you remember that? GM went bankrupt. And what did Mr. Obama allow them to do? They paid off the union pensions, but not the shareholders. How can that be? Government's purpose is to protect private property. Every shareholder should have gotten a piece of the pie before the pensions for the workers. In fact, some would say that the workers were required by law to help pay off the debt by the company because they're part of the company. They had joint ownership, right? To a degree. I just throw that out as a good argument. Yes, sir.
In that case, they paid the union pensions, but they didn't pay the non-union.
That's correct.
That was also
That's correct.
something that they did wrong.
Well, or the big deal was when they had the banking crisis and the government allowed all the banks to stop paying dividends that were required under their contracts and law, which meant that millions of older Americans went hungry because all these banking stocks, people were depending on them for their dividends, and they're really safe stocks, right? Until the government allows them to stop paying their obligations. That's why government's purpose is to protect private property. And the laws of the court should be working with us to prevent that kind of loss. Now I want to move over here. We've kind of covered a little bit of the points of the point here, but I wanted to go into property harm, capitalism. Capitalism. This is really important. We kind of talked about some of these ideas, but I really want you to have an important view of this because I listed, for example, on the list of the stuff, the power of our federal government. It says today Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposed. I won't read all this to you. To borrow money, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with the Indian tribes. Does it say anything about to regulate businesses? It says regulate commerce. By the way, that's how FDR and the Supreme Court and the government, the Congress, got it under the table, under the tent. Was they said commerce is whatever you are selling. And therefore, we can regulate commerce. It's called a Commerce Clause or Commerce, I think it's Commerce Clause. Anyway, it's been set in law. It never was believed to be that for the first almost 200 years of our nation. But suddenly, the government can control commerce, control complete commerce, therefore business, which, by the way, leads you to a fascist economy. That's where we are.
Loophole than a clause.
What's that?
More of a loophole than a clause.
Yeah, more of a loophole. I agree, 100%. Go down a little bit. It says to coin money, regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Okay, this is really important to me. Do they coin money anymore today? They make bills. How do they set the value? How do they regulate the value of money?
How much you got in the bank?
It's a guarantee.
How much gold you got in the
The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, created in about the early 20s, the Federal Reserve is what really sets the value of money in America. They used to be set under a gold standard. So, I think it was $32 an ounce or something like that, $32, $35 an ounce. That was the price of the dollar to gold. FDR took us off not the gold standard, but what are called gold contracts, and basically made it illegal for the average person to own gold, which was what caused the Depression to last from 1929 to 1947. Every country in the world except the United States was out of the Great Depression in 5 years. Part of the reason was because the government stopped setting the value of the dollar and stopped allowing, they still set the value of the dollar by gold. It was Bretton Woods, that was a requirement. But they stopped allowing gold contracts and people to own gold. If you stop people from owning gold, that means that you can't take your gold and silver certificates to the bank, which you were allowed to before FDR's rule, and you could go to the reserve bank or to the bank from any American bank and say, here's a gold certificate or a silver certificate, I want my gold. And they had to do it, and they had to do it at the rate that was set by Congress. Because it says right here in the Constitution, they will set the value thereof. However, today, we have a fiat currency. Now, no fiat currency except our currency has lasted more than 40 years. The Wall Street Journal marked the 40-year mark because no currency had ever lasted as a fiat currency for more than 40 years. What happens in fiat currencies is, well, what sets the value of fiat currency?
Promises of good faith to the government to honor that amount.
Kind of. It's actually set by the number of dollars I print. So let's say, you can't really calculate directly this way, but let's say the U.S. is worth $100 trillion in all its property value and everything. If I take that and I divide it by the number of dollars that are out in currency, then that theoretically should tell me how much the value is. The problem is that what causes, okay, and here we go, this is the kind of the segue. What causes inflation? Printing more money than you have available in your treasury. So the deficit spending, and see, that's why it's a little different than you said. I don't necessarily disagree. It's a full faith in currency, a full faith in whatever of the U.S. government. However, it isn't really. It's really how many dollars they have printed beyond what they have in value. Now the problem is, and you may be hearing this for the first time, you may be hearing this before, we are all Keynesians now. That's what Nixon said when he pulled us off the gold standard. We're all Keynesians now. The price, you can see the price of, you can see the inflation in the price of postage stamps. We paid 2 cents to spend a letter all the way till FDR. When FDR started, it went to 3 cents, which is 33% inflation, by the way. And then all of a sudden, when Nixon took us off Bretton Woods and took us off the gold standard, how much is it today? 62 cents and rising, and they have forever stance to hide the value because they don't want you to know. It has gone like this. It's like the hockey puck supposedly with fake global warming hoax. We have a inflation problem. Why is there an inflation problem? Deficit spending, inflation. Now, since Keynes, Maynard Keynes, and by the way, one of the greatest adherents to Maynard Keynes was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also was the only leader in the modern world of a republic to die in office from natural causes. All the others were killed. Hitler, Franco, El Duce, Mussolini, they were all killed, generally fighting wars. But he's about the only socialist kind of leader of a republic left. By the way, those were all Republicans, and all those guys were voted into office. It's interesting, we had to change and make another amendment to not allow that to happen ever again. And even Democrats supported that in large measure. But ever since the great Keynesian, FDR, was in office, and by the way, like I said, Nixon said we're all Keynesians now. What does that mean? Maynard Keynes was a socialist. And Maynard Keynes said that to have growth, you must have inflation. So therefore, if you have a fiat currency, you can directly inflate dollars. The government wants to inflate dollars. They inflate the dollar by 2 to 3% per year. Their goal today, right now, is 2% per year. 2% per year means you can calculate this out really easily. Okay, we've got 2%. I can't read that. I got one. 2% per year. 2% per year in 10 years. How much inflation? 20%. 30 years. 30%. You know, I used to pay 10 years ago or so, let's say 20 years ago, I used to pay $1 for lunch. Anybody else pay $1 for lunch? I used to go to a restaurant, pay $1 for lunch. What's it cost to go to Dillon's? Let's say you buy their, actually it's pretty good, cheap lunch. You will pay $10. $10 for, a pretty good portion that you probably shouldn't be eating that much, but, still.
The only reason I know that I went to the donut shop a couple days ago, my son-in-law, and he about fell over, couldn't pay for it.
Yeah. However, this is the pre-planned amount. In the last 4 years, we've had more than 20% gross inflation over 4 years. That means you're paying, in addition to your 20%, just add up. So you got 4 years, 8%, let's say 10% plus about 20%, you're paying 30%. What's causing the inflation? There's only one cause for inflation. Deficit spending.
More money during the recovery.
Deficit spending.
That's in all these laws.
Now, why does the government want inflation? You realize the government wants inflation, right? Why do they want inflation?
The deficit is at less value.
It costs them less to repay their debt.
It costs them less to repay their debt in 2 ways. In the first way, they pay with pre-inflation dollars. They pay their debt with pre-inflated dollars. The other way is it actually reduces their bond costs. Their bond value goes up. However, there's a double-edged sword with this. As the bond issues go up, for example, what's the Federal Reserve rate? It was like 6%, right? It was like almost zero, 0.25, about 1/4%, and now it's 6%. That means when the government borrows money, which they have to do when they have inflated dollars, they're paying 6%. Actually, when we say they, who are they? You. Every piece of inflation is paid by you. By you. Everything you buy. Now, let's talk about capitalism. I know we don't know it. Super. Oh, come on. What? Yeah, no. Let's talk about capitalism. Here's a great question for you. Can you inflate a gold-based currency? Is it possible to have inflation with a gold-based currency? Or of any commodity-based currency? It can't be. Because if I set the value of the dollar, for example, to, let's say, $32 an ounce, that means to make more money, I have to have more gold. And if gold is in the hands of the people own the commodity. Now, gold has no inherent value. Remember, this is what we talked about before. There's no inherent value in gold.
I mean, it's the scarcity piece of it. So, like, if say we bring a new year or something, and they bring it all back, so now we tenfold more gold now than we ever had before. What would happen then?
If you had the set value of the commodity to the dollar or to your currency, that means simply that the currency value stays the same, or the government by law could change the value. I don't call it regulate, by law, they could change the value of the currency to match the amount in a better way. Now, here's a really, really important point that in capitalism, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but one point that is very important for you to know. What does commodity value do over time, except gold? Gold is an oddity. What does commodity value always do? Always must go down. Must go down. Must go down. If it doesn't go down, what has happened? How come your rates of your electricity are going up? That's a commodity, right? What is causing your electricity rate to go up? Any idea? Well, it's not so much the monopoly, and go call them. Call Evergy and say, why is the rates going up? And they will tell you, because of green energy mandates that are requiring the solar and the wind energy. The solar and wind energy are really, 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 really expensive. In the Wall Street Journal this week, there was an article of why are electrical rates so low in Florida, but they're higher in Texas and all the states around it. And the reason is because Florida is dependent on natural gas for their electric production and not for solar or wind. However, even Texas has gone way crazy with wind. And by the way, does anybody remember the freezing of the wind turbines? Yeah. Yeah. The problem with a commodity is if the government gets involved. One of the reasons that gold does not decrease as commodity because, anybody know why it doesn't? The value of gold is a hedge. It's called a hedge. The value of gold is directly connected to the value of the dollar. You say, well, how could that be? We've disconnected it since Bretton Woods and Nixon, right? But if you look at the value of the dollar and the value of gold, they track almost exactly. You will not make money by keeping gold, but you will keep the money you have because, like I said, gold is a hedge, but not an investment. Isn't that interesting? However, the actual commodity value of gold is going down. The problem with inflation is you got a dollar, but you know your dollar is worth 10 cents less, $1 less after 30 years, savings of cash. Maybe don't be saving cash. Maybe we'll continue to expand on this because I think it's a very important issue, but you know, I'm trying to touch the most important, I think, aspects, and I don't know if you have other ideas or want something, send me an email, because I can, you know, segue to the other faucets in the list that I put on the front thing before. But I think these are really important issues to kind of look at. Thank you, Father, for your word and pray you look after us this week when we pray.
No class next week, God.
Oh, no class next week. Oh, good. No, I didn't forget. I just